Hello, good morning, everyone. So firstly, thank you so much for having me here today, Startup Grind. I'm lucky enough to be in the Bay Area for 3 months. I'm usually in London, where at the moment the skies are pretty much 100% cloud cover. I never see the sun, so thank you, California, for the dose of vitamin C. What I'm going to be talking to you about today is raising money in the US, in the Bay Area in particular, as an international company. So what is Entrepreneur First? What is EF? We are the best place in the world to find your co-founder, which means we work with the earliest stage startups, because when we invest in an individual that doesn't have a team, that doesn't have an idea, and we help them go through the process of developing that team, developing that idea, and getting them to the point where they can raise seed capital. We've been doing this for 10 years. Our HQ is in London, but we have offices in Paris, Berlin, Bangalore, Singapore, and Toronto. So we have a really unique bird's eye perspective of what does it mean to grow a startup from scratch across some of the world's more nascent, but very, very fast-growing ecosystems. Entrepreneur First itself has raised money from some of the world's best investors, including Greylock and Founders Fund. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of the things I've learned as a founder, as a kind of British founder raising in the Bay Area. But I think what's more interesting for you guys is that our companies have raised from some of the world's best investors, both at Series A from some of the big names like Andreessen and Sequoia and Khosla, but more and more frequently now, raising from probably some of the angels or VCs you might not have heard of, and that's something I'm also going to touch on. I think over the last 3 years, we've had about 50 of our companies that have raised money in the US, so coming from either Europe, Asia, or other parts of North America, and coming here to raise their early stage rounds. So what am I doing in the Bay Area? I'm here because we want to get more and more of our companies funded in the US. We believe that there is a real advantage to taking US capital very early on your startup's journey. The quality of the ambition, the speed, the urgency, the insight that you can get from working alongside some of the world's best investors who have seen multiple unicorns being birthed and grown is absolutely invaluable. And I've basically spent the last 3 weeks, day in, day out, talking to more than 50 investors, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've learned. So what are the main lessons? I think the thing that has really struck me is back in 2017, we came to raise Entrepreneur First Series A in the Bay Area. In 2017, there was a lot of like, oh, a European company. This is interesting and novel. I wouldn't say that investors were leaping to jump into our Series A. There was definitely a sort of a question mark about, well, what does it mean to have a board seat in a company that isn't based in the Bay Area? This has changed completely. Coming back now after the pandemic, Zoom has become the norm. Suddenly, investors are not just happy to meet startups over Zoom, they're actually preferring to meet startups over Zoom. I've been asking, should our companies come out to the US physically to come and meet you? And they say, no, not for the first meeting, not for the second meeting, maybe for the investment committee. But they're even happy to do investment committees over Zoom, and happy to take board seats over Zoom. I think it's also worth seeing that as the pandemic went through, and as investors got used to investing outside of their kind of immediate local jurisdiction, it means that they now have boards, often all over the world. And so they're happy to jump on a plane. They're happy to kind of leap outside of their local surroundings. And it's worth noting that because the prices in the Bay Area have become so frothy, actually there's a real advantage for investors to looking outside of the local area, because they can get very, very high quality startups, often at a much more reasonable price compared to what they're seeing here. So I'm, after a couple of weeks of speaking to investors, feeling very, very excited about the opportunity that there is now for international startups that do want to access US funding. I think one of the things that has been interesting is kind of sorting the different funds that I've met into different categories. There are the big name funds, the ones that the brands that we've all heard of. And to be honest, they get amazing deal flow. They often have startups falling on their doorsteps trying to raise money. And if you're thinking about raising money, I would encourage you to think very carefully about who is the right investor for you. It may be that some of the big brand names aren't the right investor for you. Remember, the competition for their dollar is going to be intense and fierce because they're the ones that everyone has heard of. What's really impressed me over the last couple of weeks is that actually the people who are actively seeking out international startups are often the funds that you haven't heard of. They're often maybe one or two GPs running a kind of $50 to $150 million fund. And because they don't necessarily have such a strong path of deal flow as some of the big brand names that we've all heard of, they're much keener to actively seek out and get in front of international companies. So as you're thinking about your strategy for how you might want to raise in the US, I would encourage you to really, really dig into, okay, who are the investors who have recently done rounds in the country that you're based in? You know, who is actively already deploying capital into Germany, into France, into Gibraltar, into wherever it may be? Those are the ones that you need to pin down. And even if you haven't heard of them, I would get in front of them, see what they're like, see if you align with them, see if you click with them, and see if they could be a good fit for your startup. Investors need to know about you. If they don't know about you, they're not going to invest in you. But it's not just knowing about you. It's also about creating signal that you're one of the very best startups that they could possibly deploy their capital into. I think one of the errors that we see when I talk to companies in London or Paris, they say, oh, it'd be much easier to raise if I was in the US. There are so many dollars in the US. It'll be so easy to raise. Yeah, but it's also incredibly competitive because everyone is going after those dollars. To make you stand out, you need to generate signal. Let me give you a story to help you understand what I'm talking about. We raised our Series A from Reid Hoffman. He's the co-founder of LinkedIn and one of the partners at Greylock. It's probably one of the weirdest pitch meetings of my life. Me and my co-founder, Matt, we were out in San Francisco meeting investors. We weren't due to meet Reid, but somebody introduced us to him, and we went to go and see him, sort of 5 days after the first email. After about 15 minutes into the meeting, he said, yeah, great, cool, sounds good. How much do you want? We were like, what? It is true. San Francisco is paved with gold. The Bay Area is paved with gold. But it's not that simple. What had actually happened is the person who had originally introduced us to Reid, who was one of our early investors in London, he'd also got 3 or 4 other angels that were highly, highly rated and knew Reid personally to drop Reid an email saying, you really need to meet Matt and Alice. This is one of the most exceptional startups that you can see coming out of Europe right now. This is where you need to put your dollar. So really, the meeting with Reid wasn't a pitch meeting. It was enabling Reid to just kind of sign off on what his friends had already told him. That's creating signal. So as you go about meeting investors, as you think about trying to raise your round out here, think about who do you have in your network who can help generate signal. And if you don't know the people that have connections out here already, it might be worth not just trying to meet investors out here, but working out who do you know locally who has those connections, who can be an advocate for your company. It might actually be easier for you to meet them locally, get them on board with what you're doing, and then using that connection to get the introduction and to build that signal to get that round done. One of the things that I'm hearing again and again from US-based funds, Bay Area funds that are investing internationally, is they often have a couple of trusted partners in each jurisdiction that they invest in. You know, they might have a friend in Paris that was a friend of one of the kind of founding GPs. And actually, if you can get to know that person and use that as the in to meet the fund, you're much more likely to generate the signal that not only gets you the meeting, but gets you the term sheet. Bay Area investors expect you to move fast. And I think I always knew this. But over the last couple of weeks speaking to these investors, I've been really trying to dig into, what does this mean? I was asking an investor what is the most common mistake she sees from European startups. She was European as well, and she had a really, really great insight. And she said, well, the problem is they come out to the Bay Area, and an investor says, when are you going to close your round? And they say, end of Q2, maybe mid Q3. Now, my perspective as a European founder would be like, well, that sounds very sensible. That's a totally reasonable thing to say about when the round might close. It's probably realistic if you're raising in Europe or Asia. What the US investor hears is, sorry, what? How slow are you moving? Does that mean that no one else wants to invest in your round? So when you think about speed, when you think about urgency, I would encourage you to think about what are the things that you're talking about that actually indicate that you may not be moving as fast as US investors expect. I was talking to one investor yesterday, having lunch, and she was saying, I expect teams to have a 4-week process. 1 week where they prepare themselves, 1 week where they meet their tier 2 investors, where they can kind of practice their pitch and have all their errors knocked out of them. 1 week where they pitch their top tier investors, and then 1 week to get the deal done. And at every meeting that they're going to, they're telling investors that's their timeline. We're going to be closing in 2 weeks' time. We're closing on, this date. So if you want to be in, you've got to let us know by then. The other place that we're seeing, that I'm seeing speed and urgency come up and being mentioned, is they want to see movement in the product. Some of you may have heard this phrase: investors invest in lines, not dots. Meaning that investors don't want a single snapshot of where you are. Today's traction goes out of date very, very quickly. They want to see the line of you started here and you're moving way, way faster. Your velocity, your speed of progress far outstrips any other startup. This is so important at the seed stage. At the seed stage, investors are largely investing in the team. We call it productivity as traction for teams. The teams that we invest in are the ones that are moving the fastest, building the fastest. Sort of doesn't matter what they're doing, but it proves that the team is exceptional at making progress. That's what Bay Area investors want to see as well. And what the feedback that I've had on some of the companies that they're seeing that are coming from Europe and Asia is often they're much more considered. They will say something like, yeah, we really hope that the product will be done in 6 months. We really hope that we'll nail this customer in the next couple of months. What they want to hear is, we're making progress today. By next week, X will happen. By the week after, Y will happen. And let me show you and take you on that journey. Let me keep you updated so that I can build more signal to make you confident that it is the right time to invest. And the last piece is, I think often when you're out in Europe or Asia, you get told, they're so ambitious in the US, so much more ambitious. But what does that actually mean? What does it mean? Well, I think part of it is about speed and urgency, that you are so ambitious for how fast your round can move, you're so ambitious for how fast your product can move. But I think just to share another story from a different investor, she was talking about looking at the pitch deck and saying, well, why is the sales growth so conservative? It was a European pitch deck. Why is the sales growth so conservative? Now, the founder was trying to be realistic. And I think, to be honest, having worked with a lot of European and Asian VCs, they are looking for a more realistic best guess. At seed stage, everything is a best guess. They're looking for a more realistic best guess of what you think you can achieve. But actually, what she was saying was US investors are already discounting what you think you can achieve. They already assume there is hubris, an amount of hubris baked into what you're saying. So when they saw numbers that they felt were compressed, numbers that they felt were too small, that they felt were maybe too realistic, they assumed that the founder knew something about the market that they didn't know. So they assumed there was an issue with the market. They assumed there was an issue with the founder's ambition. So some of this may seem intuitive to some of you. Some of you, this may seem counterintuitive and surprising. I hope it is the latter, because a lot of what I've learned over the last 3 weeks has challenged how I think about our companies coming out to raise in the US. For those of you who are thinking about raising, good luck. It is a tricky and difficult path, but one that if you raise good process, if you have good process, if you meet enough people, and if you have those ambitious, speedy timelines, hopefully you can get to a good outcome. Thank you so much for having me today. I've been Alice Bentinck. Thank you.